poetically and philosophically. But in transcriptions, the pauses, rhythm, and emphasis that give his words their deeper meaning and hold his thoughts together are apt to be lost. So Trudy worked many months by herself and with Suzuki Roshi to retain his original words and flavor, and yet produce a manuscript that is in understandable English. Trudy divided the book according to emphasis into 3 sections. Right practice, right attitude, and right understanding, roughly corresponding to body, feeling, and mind. She also chose the titles for the talks and the epigraphs that follow the titles, these being taken usually from the body of the lectures. The choices are of course somewhat arbitrary, but she did this to set up a kind of tension between the specific sections, titles, and epigraphs, and the talks themselves. The relationship between the talks and these added elements will help the reader probe the lectures. The only talk not given originally to the Los Altos group is the Epilogue, which is a condensation of 2 talks given when Zen Center moved into its new San Francisco headquarters. Shortly after finishing work on this book, Trudy died of cancer at the age of 30. She is survived by her 2 children, Annie and Will, and her husband, Mike, a painter. He contributed the drawing of the fly on this page. A Zen student for many years, when asked to do something for this book, he said, "I can't do a Zen drawing. I can't do a drawing for anything other than the drawing. I certainly can't see doing drawings of Zaifo, meditation pillows, or lotuses or ersatz something. I can see this idea, though." A realistic fly often occurs in Mike's paintings. Suzuki Roshi is very fond of the frog, which sits so still it might be asleep, but is alert enough to notice every insect that comes by. Maybe the fly is waiting for the frog. Trudy and I worked together throughout the development of Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and she asked me to complete the editing and see the book through to publication. After considering several publishers, I found that John Weatherhill Incorporated, through Meredith Weatherby and Audie Bach, were able to polish, design, and publish this book in exactly the way it should be published. The manuscript was read before publication by Professor Kogen Mizuno, head of the Buddhist Studies Department, Komizawa University, and an outstanding scholar of Indian Buddhism. He generously helped with the transliteration of the Sanskrit and Japanese Buddhist terms. Except for now and again in lectures, Suzuki Roshi seldom talks about his past, but this much I have pieced together. He was the disciple of Gyakujun Soan Roshi. He had other teachers. The most influential for him was Kishizawa Ian Roshi, a leading authority and lecturer on Dogen. Kishizawa Roshi emphasized a deep and careful understanding of Dogen, the koans, particularly the Blue Cliff Records and the Sutras. Suzuki Roshi was 12 when he began his apprenticeship under his father's disciple, Gyakujun. After years living with his teacher, he continued his practice and study at a Buddhist university, Komizawa, and at the main Soto training monasteries, Ihiji and Sochiji. He also studied with a Rinzai teacher for a while. Gyakujun Roshi died when Suzuki was 30. As a result, he had the responsibility, at a rather young age, of both his father's temple, who had died shortly before Gyakujun, and his teacher's temple. The latter, Rinsoin, was a small monastery and head temple for about 200 other temples. One of his main tasks was the rebuilding of Rinsoin in the exacting tradition his teacher and he wanted. Exceptional for Japan during the 1930s and 40s, he led discussion groups at Rinsoin that questioned the militaristic assumptions and actions of the times. Before the war, and from the time he was young, he had been interested in coming to America. However, at the insistence of his teacher, he had given up the idea. But in 1956 and twice again in 58, a friend, who was one of the leaders of the Soto school, persisted in asking him to go to San Francisco to lead the Japanese Soto congregation there. On the third request, Suzuki Roshi accepted. In 1959, when he was 55, he came to America. After postponing his return several times, he decided to stay in America. He stayed because he found that Americans have a beginner's mind, that they have few preconceptions about Zen, are quite open to it, and confidently believe that it can help their lives. He found they question Zen in a way that gives Zen life. Shortly after his arrival, several people stopped by and asked if they could study Zen with him. He said he did Zazen early every morning and they could join him if they liked. Since then a rather large Zen group has grown up around him, now in 6 locations in California. At present he spends most of his time at Zen Center, 300 Page Street, San Francisco, where about 60 students live and many more do Zazen regularly, and at Zen Mountain Center at Tassajara Springs above Carmel Valley. This latter is the first Zen monastery in America, and there another 60 or so students live and practice for 3-month or longer periods. Trudy felt that understanding how Zen students feel about their teacher might, more than anything else, help the reader to understand these talks. What the teacher really offers the student is literally living proof that all this talk and the seemingly impossible goals can be realized in this lifetime. The deeper you go in your practice, the deeper you find your teacher's mind is, until you finally see that your mind and his mind are Buddha's mind. And you find that Zazen meditation is the most perfect expression of your actual nature. The following tribute from Trudy to her teacher describes very well the relationship between Zen teacher and Zen student. Arashi is a person who has actualized that perfect freedom which is the potentiality for all human beings. He exists freely in the fullness of his whole being. The flow of his consciousness is not the fixed repetitive patterns of our usual self-centered consciousness, but rather arises spontaneously and naturally from the actual circumstances of the present. The results of this in terms of the quality of his life are extraordinary buoyancy, vigor, straightforwardness, simplicity, humility, serenity, joyousness, uncanny perspicacity, and unfathomable compassion. His whole being testifies to what it means to live in the reality of the present. Without anything said or done, just the impact of meeting a personality so developed can be enough to change another's whole way of life. But in the end it is not the extraordinariness of the teacher which perplexes, intrigues, and deepens the student, it is the teacher's utter ordinariness. Because he is just himself, he is a mirror for his students. When we are with him we feel our own strengths and shortcomings without any sense of praise or criticism from him. In his presence we see our original face, and the extraordinariness we see is only our own true nature. When we learn to let our own nature free, the boundaries between master and student disappear in a deep flow of being and joy in the unfolding of Buddha mind. Richard Baker. Kyoto, 1970. Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. It is wisdom which is seeking for wisdom. Prologue. Beginner's mind. In the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's there are few. People say that practicing Zen is difficult, but there is a misunderstanding as to why. It is not difficult because it is hard to sit in the cross-legged position, or to attain enlightenment. It is difficult because it is hard to keep our mind pure and our practice pure in its fundamental sense. The Zen school developed in many ways after it was established in China, but at the same time, it became more and more impure. But I do not want to talk about Chinese Zen or the history of Zen. I am interested in helping you keep your practice from becoming impure. In Japan we have the phrase Shoshin, which means beginner's mind. The goal of practice is always to keep our beginner's mind. Suppose you recite the Prajnaparamita Sutra only once. It might be a very good recitation. But what would happen to you if you recited it twice, 3 times, 4 times, or more? You might easily lose your original attitude towards it. The same thing will happen in your other Zen practices. For a while you will keep your beginner's mind. But if you continue to practice 1, 2, 3 years or more, although you may improve some, you are liable to lose the limitless meaning of original mind. For Zen students the most important thing is not to be dualistic. Our original mind includes everything within itself. It is always rich and sufficient within itself. You should not lose your self-sufficient state of mind. This does not mean a closed mind, but actually an empty mind and a ready mind. If your mind is empty, it is always ready for anything. It is open to everything. In the beginner's mind there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind there are few. If you discriminate too much, you limit yourself. If you are too demanding or too greedy, your mind is not rich and self-sufficient. If we lose our original self-sufficient mind, we will lose all precepts. When your mind becomes demanding, when you long for something, you will end up violating your own precepts. Not to tell lies, not to steal, not to kill, not to be immoral, and so forth. If you keep your original mind, the precepts will keep themselves. In the beginner's mind there is no thought, I have attained something. All self-centered thoughts limit our vast mind. When we have no thought of achievement, no thought of self, we are true beginners. Then we can really learn something. The beginner's mind is the mind of compassion. When our mind is compassionate, it is boundless. Dogen Zenji, the founder of our school, always emphasized how important it is to resume our boundless original mind. Then we are always true to ourselves, in sympathy with all beings, and can actually practice. So the most difficult thing is always to keep your beginner's mind. There is no need to have a deep understanding of Zen. Even though you read much Zen literature, you must read each sentence with a fresh mind. You should not say, I know what Zen is, or I have attained enlightenment. This is also the real secret of the arts. Always be a beginner. Be very careful about this point. If you start to practice Zazen, you will begin to appreciate your beginner's mind. It is the secret of Zen practice.